I was 67 the night my own son stood in the kitchen where his mother had died and told me I had until morning to be gone. I had $42 in my wallet, a truck that shouldn't have started, and no idea that he'd been at this for the better part of 5 years, or that the brakes on that truck weren't meant to get me anywhere near spring. Let me back up. The house was on a concession road about 40 minutes out of town, in that stretch of the Ottawa Valley where the fields go on flat and gray after the harvest and the wind comes down off the shield with nothing to slow it. My late wife Estelle and I bought it in 1986 when the kids were small. She was the one who loved it. I just paid the mortgage and cursed the furnace every February. When she got sick, it was her lungs. Near the end it was everywhere. She made a will and she left the house to me. Not to the kids, to me. I remember thinking that was strange even then, because she and I had been more roommates than sweethearts for a good many years by that point. But she looked at me from the hospital bed in Kingston and she said, "You'll need somewhere to stand." I didn't understand what she meant. I understand now. She'd been gone 4 years the night it happened. My son and his wife had moved back in to help me manage, which is a phrase that means something different than it sounds. He'd taken over the bills. He'd taken me down to the bank himself, told the girl at the counter his father wasn't good with the online part of things anymore, and had me sign a paper he said was to let him pay the hydro and the property tax so I wouldn't miss anything. I signed it. What kind of a father doesn't trust his own boy with the hydro bill? That was the paper. I know that now too. It's the middle of November, and they've got me sitting at my own kitchen table, and he's standing by the doorway with his coat already on, and his wife is a step behind him the way she always stood, like she'd been coached. He starts in about the debts. There are always debts, apparently. Estelle's treatments, the ones the province didn't cover, the private stuff we tried at the end. The line of credit against the house. He says it's slow and careful, like he's reading it off a card, and every sentence ends with the house has to be sold. And until it sells, I can't be in it, because the buyer wants it empty, and there's mold and it's a liability, and on and on. Where am I supposed to go, I said. He didn't answer that. His wife looked at the floor. Outside the window the yard was already going white with the first real snow of the year, and I remember thinking about how Estelle used to stand at that same window with her coffee and watch the deer come out of the tree line at dusk. "How long have I got?" I said. "Tonight," he said. "We need you out tonight. I want to tell you I fought. I want to tell you I stood up and I roared like some man in a film. I didn't. I was 67. I hadn't worked since the mill in Smith's Falls cut back and let the older fellows go, and I had, as far as I knew that night, whatever was left in a bank account I hadn't been able to log into for 2 years because my son handled all that. I had no leverage. I went upstairs and I got the old canvas pack I used to take fishing up on the French River, and I put in 2 shirts, my razor, Estelle's reading glasses, because I couldn't leave them, and the photo of the 4 of us from Canada Day when the kids were young and we all still liked each other. $42. The keys to the truck, a 98 half-ton that ran on prayer and WD-40. And I walked out my own front door into the snow while my son stood in the porch light and my daughter-in-law wouldn't look at me. I slept in the truck that first night in the Tim Hortons lot on the edge of town because it was the only place with lights on, and I felt less alone with people going through the drive-thru. I bought a coffee I couldn't really afford, so nobody would move me along. The heater in the truck worked if you kept the engine idling, so I did, and I watched the frost creep up the inside of the windshield anyway, and I thought about a lot of things a man thinks about at 3 in the morning that I won't put on you here. In the morning I drove to the bank. I figured, all right, whatever the situation with the house, I've got my own money and my pension, and I'll get a room at the motel by the highway, and I'll sort this out. There's a thing you learn at 67 that you don't want to learn, which is exactly how alone you are when you go to solve a problem, and find out the solving was taken care of long before you ever noticed there was a problem. The girl at the counter was kind about it, which almost made it worse. She turned her screen a bit and she said there was a power of attorney on the account. Financial power of attorney, continuing meaning it survived even if I lost my marbles, which I hadn't. My son held it. My Canada pension and my old age security both went into that account by direct deposit and out again, and I couldn't so much as pull $40 without him, because the way the paperwork was drawn, I'd apparently agreed he was to manage all of it. The paper I signed for the hydro bill, except it wasn't for the hydro bill. I asked her how a man revokes such a thing. She said I could. Of course, I could revoke it any time. But she said it careful, and I understood there was a but coming, and the but was that the money already moved was already moved, and the address on the account had been changed to his, and I'd need to bring identification, and my driver's license had my old address, and my health card was in a kitchen drawer in a house I was no longer allowed to enter. You start to see how a net like that is woven. Not in one night, over years, one little paper at a time, each one reasonable on its own. I didn't cry in the bank. I did that later, in the truck, and I'm not ashamed to tell you now, though I was then. Here's the part where I know some of you are already yelling at your screen, "Why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you get a lawyer? Why didn't you fight?" I did. I want you to know I did. I drove to the OPP detachment, and I sat with a young constable, Whitmore his name was, and I told him the whole thing, and he was decent about it, but he told me the truth, which is that a signed power of attorney and a family money dispute is, in the eyes of the law on a Tuesday afternoon, a civil matter, and civil matters don't get a cruiser sent out. "Sir, if there's fraud, if there's forgery, that's different," he said, "but you'd need to prove it. And right now it's your word that you didn't understand what you signed." He gave me a pamphlet for a legal aid clinic in town. I want you to hold on to that constable, because he comes back into this, and when he does it matters. The legal aid lawyer was a sharp woman named Ms. Poirier, worked out of an office above the pharmacy with a space heater and a stack of files to the ceiling. She listened to the whole thing, and she didn't sugarcoat it. She said the strongest thing I had was that Estelle's will left the house to me, free and clear, and if my son was moving to sell it, he'd have to be doing it through a power of attorney over property, not just money, and that was a separate document, and if I'd never knowingly signed one, then he either had my signature on something I didn't understand, or he had my signature on something I never signed at all. "Do you have a copy of the will?" she asked me. I didn't. The lawyer who'd done it for Estelle had retired and closed up, and the file had gone somewhere, and the original, Estelle always said she'd put the original somewhere safe. She never told me where. That was Estelle. She kept things close. I left that office with more hope than I'd had and no proof of anything, which is its own particular kind of torture. That's when I saw the ad, if you can call a sheet of paper taped in the window of the town office an ad. Municipal tax sale. The county sells off properties when the taxes go unpaid long enough, and there was a list, and near the bottom was a parcel out on the 9th concession. A house and a couple of acres. Minimum tender, almost nothing because nobody in their right mind wanted it. I had a little cash. Poirier had helped me get released. A small hardship amount, enough for a motel week or a bus ticket to my daughter's. And I hadn't spoken to my daughter in 3 years and wasn't about to start by showing up broke and homeless. So I did the stupidest, best thing I've ever done. I put nearly all of it into a tender on a wreck of a house I'd never set foot in. I won it. Of course I won it. Nobody bids against a man for the privilege of freezing to death. When I drove out to see what I'd bought, I sat in the truck at the end of the lane for a good 10 minutes before I could make myself go up. It was a story-and-a-half farmhouse from probably the 20s, the kind with the steep roof and the little peaked window in the gable. Half the porch had gone down. The windows on the north side were broken and somebody'd stapled up feed bags over them. There was a maple that had come down across the woodshed some winter and nobody'd cut it up. Inside smelled like mice and cold and old wood smoke. The kitchen had a wood stove, an ancient Findlay oval, rusted but whole. There was a hand pump at the sink because the place was on a dug well, and when I worked the handle after 20 minutes of priming it with meltwater, it coughed and spat and then ran clear and cold, and I stood there with my hands under it and I laughed out loud in an empty house for the first time in I don't know how long. I'm going to tell you how I ate and drank, because I know it's the thing people can't get past, and fair enough. The well ran, so I had water. I boiled it on the stove to be safe until I could get it tested, which the county health unit does for free. You pick up the little bottles at the town office. For food, that first while, I'll be honest, it was thin. I had a bag of split peas and a sack of rice and a case of Kraft Dinner I bought at the Foodland with my last bit of money because it's the cheapest hot food there is, and everybody in this country over a certain age has kept themselves alive on it at least once. I made a soup that lasted days. And there was the diner. There's always a diner. This one was run by a woman named Jeanette who'd been there since Trudeau the First, and she caught on quick that I was in a bad way. Small towns catch on quick, and she never once made a thing of it. She'd have me shovel the walk and the little lot out back when it snowed, which it did most nights, and she'd pay me in a bowl of soup and a plate of whatever didn't sell and a coffee I never had to buy. "You're doing me a favor. The walk's a liability," she'd say, which was the same lie the constable's kindness had been. And I let her tell it because a man has to eat, and a woman like that knows the difference between charity and dignity even when they're the same thing on a plate. So that's how I ate. It wasn't much, but I never went a day without, and I want that on the record because the willpower stories are nonsense. What actually keeps a man alive is other people deciding, quietly, that he's going to be. I split wood for that Findlay stove until my hands cracked and bled, and I wrapped them in rags and split more. I got the north windows boarded proper. I slept in a bag on the floor by the stove with the truck's moving blankets over top, and some nights the wind came through the walls so hard the lamp flame would lean. But every day the house was a little more mine and a little less the winter's, and I felt something come back into me that I'd thought my son took out on his way through the porch light. Then, one gray afternoon in December, a rust-brown truck came slow up the lane, and an old fellow got out, maybe older, built like a fence post, in a Mackinaw coat the exact plaid of about half the men in this part of the country, and he stood looking at my house with his hands in his pockets, and he said, "You're the one bought the Tremblay place." His name was Malcolm. He'd farmed the next quarter over for 40 years, and had a woodlot and a shop full of every tool God ever invented, and he'd watched the Tremblay place go to ruin since the last old man died with no one to leave it to, and he told me, plain, that it had bothered him for years, and he was glad to see a light in it again. He didn't ask me my story. That's the thing about a certain kind of man out here. He'd sooner spend 3 hours helping you than 3 minutes prying into why you needed the help. He looked at the maple across my woodshed and he said, "That's good hard maple. Be ashamed to let it rot." And he came back the next morning with his saw and his splitter behind the truck, and we had that tree bucked and split and stacked in under my little woodshed by dark, and he left me half of it, said his own shed was full, which I later found out was another lie of the good kind. Over the next few weeks that man taught me more than I'd learned in 60 years. How to brace a sagging wall properly with a jack and a beam instead of hope. How to flash a chimney so the melt didn't come down the pipe. How to bank the stove at night so it'd still be alive at dawn. He'd show up with a thermos and a bag of his wife's tea biscuits. His wife had passed the winter before, and I think, looking back, that the two of us were each keeping the other one from going quiet inside an empty house. He never took a dollar. When I tried, he got so genuinely put out that I stopped trying. "You'll help the next fellow," he said. "That's how it's paid." It was Malcolm who found it. My old truck had been running rough since the drive out, pulling and shuddering, and the pedal had gone soft, and I'd chalked it up to age like everything else. One afternoon Malcolm had me pull it into his shop over the hill to look at the exhaust, and he got it up on his hoist, and he was under there a good while, and it got quiet in a way I didn't like. When he came out from under, he had his hands wiped on a rag and a look on his face I hadn't seen from him before. "Come here," he said. "I want you to see this so you don't think I'm an old fool." He showed me the brake line. He showed me where the rubber flex line met the hard line, up where you'd never look, and he showed me a place where the line had been scored. Cut most of the way through with something sharp, deliberate, and then left. "That doesn't happen," he said. "Lines rust, they rub, they wear at the clamp. They don't get a nice clean nick like that in the middle of a straight run. Somebody put a blade to that, and they did it so it'd hold for a while, and then let go the first time you leaned on the pedal hard, like coming down a grade, like the county road down to the river. I stood in that cold shop and the whole floor seemed to tilt. "When did anybody have your truck?" Malcolm asked me quiet, and I remembered. The week before they put me out, my son had taken the truck in to get the safety done for me, gone the better part of a day. Come back and said it was all set. "Don't worry about it, Dad." Kind. So kind. And I thought about the county road down to the river that I drove near every day, the long grade with the guardrail and the drop. And I thought about how a man in his 60s who goes off that grade in an old truck with failed brakes is a sad accident, an old fellow who shouldn't have been driving, and how nobody looks very hard at a thing like that, and how the house and the money would have all fallen the one way, clean, with the old man gone in the ground beside his wife, and no lawyer asking any inconvenient questions. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the stove and I felt something I'm not proud of, a heat in my chest that wanted to drive over there and put my hands on him. But I'd raised that boy. I'd taught him to skate on the pond behind the old house, and somewhere in 5 years he'd made a decision about me. That's the part that sits on you. Not what he did, that he decided. He came out to me 2 days later. I heard the vehicle before I saw it. One of those big black SUVs that cost more than my house and everything in it, sliding up my snowy lane like it owned the county. He got out in a good wool coat and clean boots, and he stood there looking at my broken porch with an expression like the smell offended him. "Jesus, Dad," he said, "what are you doing out here? You've lost it, living in a shack." He'd come with papers, of course. He always came with papers. He needed a signature. The sale of the family home had hit a snag. Turned out you can't sell a house out from under the man who legally owns it quite as easy as he'd hoped. And some title search had turned up that Estelle's will left it to me outright. And now the buyer's lawyer wanted my signature on a document transferring my interest, and my son had brought it out for me to sign, and he'd brought a pen, and he stood there in my ruined kitchen holding it out to me like I was a child who'd wandered off. "You've got to sign this," he said. "It's the only way any of this gets fixed. You get some money out of it. We set you up somewhere warm, somewhere with people to look after you." "Somewhere," I said. "Like where you had me looked after up till now." He didn't like that. He started in about the debts again, the line of credit, the treatments, and I let him get most of the way through it, and then I said, "Who took my truck in for the safety before you put me out?" I watched it land. Just a flicker. But I'd been watching this boy's face since it was 6 hours old, and I knew every flicker in it, and there it was. The fear that comes when a man realizes the thing he thought was buried has been dug up. He covered it fast. He said he didn't know what I was on about, said I was confused, said this was exactly why I couldn't be trusted to live alone, and he took a step toward me with the pen and the paper. "You should go now," I said, "and you should take that pen with you. Because you're not getting my name on anything ever again, as long as I'm above the ground." Which, I said, I understand was not the plan. He went white and then he went ugly, and he said some things a son shouldn't say to a father, about how I'd never amounted to anything, about how the mill let me go because I was useless, about how Estelle only left me the house out of pity, and then he left, and the big SUV fishtailed on my lane on the way out, and I stood in my doorway and watched the tail lights go, and I felt, God help me, almost calm, because now I knew exactly what he was, and a man who knows exactly what he's dealing with is never as helpless as one who's still hoping. I went back to the OPP the next morning, and I asked for Constable Whitmore by name, and this time I didn't have a family money dispute. I had a cut brake line, and a witness who'd been rebuilding engines since before that constable was born. And I had the date the truck was in my son's possession, and I had the receipt from the shop he'd claimed did the safety, which, when Whitmore called them, said they'd never seen my truck in their lives. That's the thing about the net my son had woven. It was all little papers, and little papers can be pulled the other way, thread by thread, once somebody with a badge decides to start pulling. Whitmore had the truck towed and gone over by a fellow the detachment uses, and that fellow wrote it up the same as Malcolm, deliberate and recent. It became, in the constable's careful words, a matter we're actively looking into. which is police for the ground has shifted under somebody, and it isn't you. But the house, the will, that was still Miss Poirier's fight, and she couldn't fight it without the original document, and Estelle had hidden it somewhere and taken the ware to her grave. I racked my brain for weeks. Estelle's? Somewhere safe. She didn't trust banks with anything sentimental. She'd said a banker's a stranger, and a stranger can't be trusted with the things that matter. She used to hide the Christmas money from the kids so well she'd forget it herself and find it in July. And then one night by the stove, half asleep, I remembered a thing she'd said the summer we finished the little study off the front room, when I was closing in the wall with tongue and groove, and she stood watching with her hand on her belly, pregnant with our daughter. She'd said, "Leave me a loose board. A woman should have one place in a house that's only hers." I'd thought she was being romantic. I'd left her a loose board behind the bookshelf and forgotten it for 30 years. I called Miss Poirier at 7 in the morning. She didn't even let me finish. Within the week, she'd gone before a judge. With the will in question, with the forged power of attorney the bank had now confirmed, didn't match the paper I described signing, with the police matter as backdrop, and she got an order allowing me, accompanied by her and by an officer, to enter the family home to retrieve documents that were rightfully mine. My son couldn't stop it. His name had come off a lot of doors that week. I'll never forget walking back into that house. It smelled the same. Estelle's coat was still on the hook by the door, because nobody had had the heart, apparently. Not even the man who'd tried to have me killed for the place. I went into the little study and I moved the bookshelf. And there behind it was the tongue and groove I'd nailed up when I was 36 years old and thought I had all the time in the world. And there was the one board that wasn't nailed, and I pried it back with a screwdriver. Malcolm had pressed on me for the trip, and I reached into the cold dark inside my own wall. There was a coffee tin. Inside it, wrapped in a freezer bag against the damp, was the original of Estelle's will, signed and witnessed, leaving me the house free and clear. There was a small key on a ribbon, a safety deposit box key, which turned out to hold the deed and some savings bonds she'd tucked away over the years that my son had never known existed, and so had never been able to touch. And there was a letter, in her hand, sealed, with my name on it, that she'd written near the end and hidden for me to find. She must have hoped, before it came to something like this. I'm not going to read you all of it. It's mine. But she wrote that she'd changed the will to leave the house to me alone, because she'd seen something in our boy that frightened her, a hardness, a hunger, that she prayed she was wrong about, and she wanted me to have one place in the world he couldn't take. "You'll need somewhere to stand," she'd said in the hospital. She'd meant it 2 ways. I stood in that room, holding my wife's handwriting with an officer waiting respectfully in the hall, and I understood that she'd tried to save my life from 4 years in the grave. And after that it went quick, the way these things do once the truth is out and standing in the open. My son was charged. Fraud over $5,000, forgery, uttering a forged document, and this was the one that mattered to me and didn't matter to the law nearly as much as it should. The tampering, which they eventually laid as its own charge. Once the shop lied its way into a corner and the timeline closed like a trap. He didn't do the time some of you would want him to. The courts in this country go easier than they ought on a man in a good coat with a good lawyer, and I'll be honest that it stung. But he was ruined all the same. The professional license he'd bragged about gone, the shine gone, his name in the county paper. My daughter-in-law left him about the time the charges came down. I don't hold anything against her. I think she was more coached than cruel, and I think she was afraid. And fear does a lot of a person's deciding for them. I heard she moved back to her people out west. The power of attorney was torn up. The CPP and the OAS came back to me. You fill out the direct deposit form at Service Canada. It takes about 6 weeks and 3 phone calls and the patience of Job. But it came back. And with the savings bonds Estelle had hidden, and the settlement Poirier squeezed out of the mess, I wasn't rich, but I was for the first time in years standing on my own 2 feet with my own money in my own name. And the family home was mine, legally finally, no question. And here's the thing nobody expects, the thing I couldn't have told you that night, in the Tim Hortons lot. I didn't want it. I drove out to the old place, my place, on a clear, cold morning after it was all settled, and I stood in the yard where Estelle used to watch the deer, and I felt nothing there but her being gone, and him being what he was. Then I drove the 40 minutes back to the wreck on the 9th concession, and Malcolm's truck was already in my lane because he'd started coming most mornings, and there was smoke coming out of my chimney because I'd banked the Findlay right for once, and I felt myself come home. So I sold the family home, put the money into the tax sale wreck that everybody said no man in his right mind would want, and made it right. New roof, real windows, the porch rebuilt square, the well tested clean, a proper furnace so I'd never again lie on a floor watching a lamp flame lean in the wind. I kept the Findlay oval though, cleaned it up and blacked it, and it sits in that kitchen yet, and it's the finest thing I own. I'm 70 now. Malcolm and I cut wood together every fall, his and mine both, and we've taken to keeping the Tremblay place, my place, open to the sledders and the skiers who come down the trail that runs along my back fence in the deep of winter, because more than one fellow has come to grief on that trail in a whiteout, and Estelle would have wanted a warm place with the light on. There's a boy from down the road, one of the Kowalczyk kids, whose father works away in the camps and who was headed for the same hardness I once saw frighten my wife, and he comes over after school, and I'm teaching him what Malcolm taught me, how to brace a wall, how to keep a fire alive overnight, and he's turning out all right. That's how it's paid, Malcolm says. You help the next fellow. I keep an oil lamp burning in the front window every night from freeze-up to break-up. Jeanette from the diner asked me once why I bother, with hydro right there in the walls now and a switch by the door. I told her the truth, which is that I spent a winter where the only light for miles was one I had to keep alive with my own 2 cracked and bleeding hands, and that on the worst nights the sight of it kept me here, and that somewhere out there in the cold and the dark of this enormous, indifferent, beautiful country there is always somebody who's just been put out into the snow by the very people who were supposed to keep them warm, and I want them to know, if they should come down that trail lost, that there's a light, and a fire, and a bowl of soup, and a door that will open. My wife told me I'd need somewhere to stand. I found it in the last place on earth anyone would look, on a lot the whole county had given up on, with $42 and a truck that wasn't meant to make it. If you're standing out in your own cold tonight, wondering whether there's any way forward from what's been taken from you, there is. I'm the living proof, and I'm just an old man from the valley who wouldn't sign the paper. Find your ruined house, keep your lamp lit, and leave the door unlocked for the next one coming down the trail behind you.